Hey again, everyone. I want to give you a little bit of a preview of this week's reading in this second brief video for the class today. In doing so, I want to just highlight a couple of key questions, ultimately, as you go through this. The Medvick piece, which is the first one I'd like you to read for the class today, is really one that I think covers a lot of the ground that we've talked about in module video 5.1. And so I think as you're reading it, you want to think about some of the details of this story that I've left out of my telling, especially the more modern story about when exactly campaign consultants came to play this supposedly central role in elections. In the previous module video, I was making the case that we're now these sort of consultant-centered campaigns. Is that true, and when did it become true, I think is an important question. And then, think about the results of recent elections. Think about the 2020 election, the 2016 election, the 2012 election, the 2008 election. If we go back and we sort of trace the rise of consultant-centered campaigns to these elections, did the results actually start to make more sense to us, or do they seem even maybe confusing as a result of this rise of campaign consultants? And really, I think that in asking these questions and comparing critically the outcomes that we see in elections today to this potential shift in the way that linkage happens, I think we're left with maybe an even more basic question, which is, do we need to spend billions of dollars on elections by hiring all these campaign consultants? Or ultimately, are campaigns diluted? Are they spending billions of dollars ultimately on snake oil? Do these consultant-centered campaigns work? Or do we have evidence to the contrary? So I think as you're reading Medvick and you're learning a little bit more about the history of candidate consultants and the rise of the consultant-centered campaign, I want you to keep thinking critically about whether or not we actually buy the idea that I'm sure consultants want you to think, that they're indispensable to winning elections today. So take a close look at that, and I think that this is going to fill in a lot of the gaps in your knowledge of the campaign-centered party that I wasn't able to cover in the previous video. If we think about the next reading, the Zeusner reading, this is, I think, a more challenging reading, specifically because it's one of the first actual empirical research papers that we're going to read in the course. We're not going to see too many of these. I've tried to keep these off the syllabus as much as possible. But I think this is a really good one because it provides what's called a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is essentially a study of studies. It's a way of accounting for what we know about a topic where many, many researchers have studied this thing in the past, and they want to know what the effects are across all of the studies that we consider to be credible today. So it's very recent. So it's a 2020 study. So it's probably the most up-to-date and the most broad-based evaluation of some key hypotheses about campaign-centered politics and its effects. And so I think it's a really nice study to read, and it's a good, maybe gentler introduction to this format, this academic scholarly paper, because as you might see, as you read through here, right, it's got formal hypotheses, it's got numbers, it's got big tables and charts. I'll talk in a moment a little bit about how to read a paper like this, and spoiler alert, it means that you get to skip over some of the stuff that is confusing and difficult to look at. But we want to think about the substance of this paper first. And so the question I have for you here is, if candidate-centered campaigns are crucial to politics today, how is it that journalists respond in their coverage of the campaign? And so Zeusner is changing our focus a little bit in this week in terms of the content, away from the campaign itself, which we've talked about in the module and in this previous reading. Now we're going to think about what media organizations do in response to the candidate-centered campaign. And so if this is something that is true, if we think that this is part of the story of campaigns today, how do journalists respond? And so Zeusner is talking about specific kinds of news values, that is, these kinds of embedded practices that modern journalists deploy to be able to respond or to cover this campaign. And I want to know, first of all, what kinds of news values do journalists deploy? And really, if we think about the paper, we can go to the hypotheses section. We can look at these different hypotheses and research questions. And we can ask ourselves, okay, so what is being tested here? That is, I think, a good way to find the answer to this question. And of course, if you've seen the phrase horse race in this paper, you'll know that you're onto something here. So what kinds of news values do journalists deploy? And then how might these practices actually influence the perceptions of voters? And that is ultimately the most important empirical questions that Soisner is thinking about in this paper, is what do we know as an entire field of media politics, whatever you want to call it. What do we as scholars know about what effects this kind of coverage of candidate-centered campaigns have on actual voters? What kinds of effects does this have on the way that individuals conceive of politics and the political environment? And so you might see in this paper, for example, something like this, Table 1 here, which is, again, looking at those effects. Effects of strategic news coverage on different outcomes. It's kind of a bad table heading here, but you can see it's got all these different outcomes here, right? Political cynicism, substance-based political knowledge, political participation, positive evaluations of news stories, attitude certainty, political efficacy, all these different concepts, all these things that have to do with what Americans think and feel about politics. Media trust, accountability of politicians, how uncertain people are about their vote choices, cynicism about public relations, anger and disgust, right? All kinds of feelings and ways of thinking about politics. And you'll see here that we've got these statistics here, Cohen's D, which is a test statistic, and a confidence interval in this test with these stars and stuff. If you've seen a table like this before and you know how to interpret it, that's great. You'll essentially be able to look through here and see, look, we've tested a lot of items here, and it turns out that these tests are statistically significant and seem to have a large effect size. Others are not statistically significant and don't have a large effect size, and so we see that maybe these effects are not as strong as the other effects. If you're looking at this and you're starting to feel lightheaded, that's fine. Don't look at it, okay? Just read the text, because any good published research paper, if the study authors are doing their job right, you should be able to skip these tables and still get the gist, still get the main conclusions of what the authors are saying about this outcome without having to go into the detailed statistical findings. This table is for specialists, for scholars to be able to look at and to critically analyze all of these effects. Similarly, with the methodology section, you're going to see a lot of big words about these different tests and stuff. Don't worry about it, okay? Just try to get the main points here. Look at the hypotheses. Look at the kinds of tests that they're trying to establish, what they're trying to find, and then read on into the conclusions and try to figure out what are the big takeaways of the study? What does this ultimately mean for the way we think about the effects, right? These effects for the way that strategic news coverage, that is the way that journalists cover campaigns, have for Americans' perceptions. So moving on to the Franklin Fowler et al. Piece, this is a piece that, again, is a book chapter. It's a little bit less technical and statistical in this way, but it's got a lot of great content in here about political advertising online. And so I want to think about this one in terms of asking a series of questions. First of all, what is the state of online political advertising, and how do we know about this topic, right? This is obviously an incredibly recent topic. If you start to look at this piece, the Franklin Fowler et al. Piece, they're writing here in 2020. This is almost as quick as we can get findings here in academic publishing, just given the fact that it takes a long time to publish things in academia. Given that we're looking at just the past couple years of our collective knowledge about the subject, what do we even know about this? Who creates online political advertising, and ultimately how is it regulated? I think is a really important question. And you'll see actually a table in the Franklin Fowler et al. Piece, just a couple pages in, that I think really raises some fascinating questions about political advertising outside of the more conventional television-based kind of mode, about especially how it's regulated. So are all online political advertisements regulated? Who creates those online political advertisements? And is it possible to create an online political advertisement that is not explicitly paid for or official, but rather created by a user? I think this raises, again, a lot of really big questions about what's going on today in the world of advertising as we move more and more to online-only settings. That being said, I think it's important to ask the question, do we think that on the basis of these scholars' evaluations, that this is coming to supplant or replace traditional TV advertising as the most important thing that campaign consultants will do in creating political ad copy? What are the kinds of features of this political content anyway? Right? Is this negative content? Is this positive content? Can we put a finger on what kind of style this even looks like? And specifically, I want to know about this idea of an issue advocacy ad. We haven't gotten too much of a chance to talk about the different kinds of political advertisements in the module, and we'll certainly talk about that in our meeting this week. But I want to think about this special form of advertising called issue advocacy, and critically ask the question of whether it's different, ultimately, than another kind of political advertisement, and whether it's treated differently or the same as conventional advertisements in terms of regulations and in terms of this new online nexus. So a lot of big, I think, very interesting questions in Franklin Fowler et al. Very, very recent questions that should lead to some pretty interesting discussions in our weekly meeting. Lastly, I just want to think about negativity, and this maybe gets us back a little bit to the Zeusner piece, thinking about these outcomes, right? When you consume political advertising, if you ever get a chance to do that, I know in Maryland it's not as frequent. When you consume this advertising, how does it generally make you feel? Does it make you feel good about voting, right? Does it have an effect on maybe who you vote for? Does it have an effect on your feelings about the candidates and maybe even the candidate who created the advertisement or the super PAC or outside spending group that created the advertisement? Does it have some kind of effects on your feeling about the civic process, about voting in general? And maybe even more broadly about our entire democratic process? Do we feel different things when we see these advertisements? Does it give us feelings of disgust, of anger, of hopefulness, of excitement? What kinds of effects do we see when we consume political advertising today, given that, as we've stated previously in this earlier part of the module, it is coming to be perhaps one of the most important sources of linkage in our political process. So I wish you all the best as you do the reading this week. Please feel free to ask any questions you might have as you're going through it. And I look very much forward to our conversation in our next class session, where we will get down and talk a little bit more about these campaigns and how they influence voters, whether they influence voters, and how media institutions critically might respond and try to accommodate this new juggernaut of linkage in the room. I'll see you next time.